When examining older RPGs, the challenge would often come from dungeon navigation and world exploration, managing your party's attributes and inventory to overcome overwhelming odds. But as years go by, more RPGs tend to focus on the enemy encounters themselves instead, implementing more complex battle systems, usually at the cost of intricate level design. Every game tends to prioritize a specific set of mechanics, and I bring this up because Final Fantasy Legend II clearly presents the benefit of this type of focused game design, along with the shift from dungeon survival to intense combat scenarios. In my previous video, I mentioned that a combination of inventory limitations, weapon durability, and permadeath defined the endurance challenges in Final Fantasy Legend. So one of the first things you'll notice about Legend 2 is that they're all gone. In fact, you'll notice in general that Final Fantasy Legend 2 is much more unhinged. Your inventory size has been doubled, which allows you to carry much more healing items. There is still an equipment limit, but being able to carry such a plentiful amount of health insurance meant that there's no need to be considerate about who you prioritize healing, because you could just restore everyone's health. You're even able to keep status curing items on the side, which was more of a luxury in the previous game. The heart system along with permadeath have been removed completely, which also means there are no longer any guilds to change up your party. Instead, if your party member gets knocked out, they'll be restored to 1 HP after the battle is over. Combine this with a new inventory filled with extra potions and you're almost guaranteed to have your party back at it again at Krispy Kreme. And the game also introduces temporary party members that come with an assortment of weaponry for when dungeons begin to get longer. You also no longer need to purchase stat boosts for human characters because they also don't exist, meaning you can spend your gold on more items and weapons, and if you're extra frugal, or a millennial, you can just run away from battles to avoid expending durability from your favourite weapons. Life is cheap, but your missile is whoppin'. It's easy to see all this as a downgrade, not only to the difficulty, but also the uniqueness as a whole. It's usually common for a sequel to dial back certain mechanics for a more streamlined approach. Some people may even go as far as to call it non-Kino. However, as I've said at the start, these changes just mean the type of challenge has a different emphasis. Robots are the new class added to this game, and they're fantastic. They can't use magic, but are able to equip multiple weapons and armor, and they actually stack. If you want, you can equip like 7 hammers and just blast a nut. Purchase 4 pairs of shoes to achieve sonic speed. Finally, I can play as Gilgamesh. Or you can wear 5 sets of armor to roleplay as a Brit. With more room for customization and min-maxing, robots can close practically any gap in your team, but not without commitment. Upon equipping a weapon to the robot, the weapon's durability will be permanently halved. The robot's equipment can also be restored when using an N, resulting in some tricky risk and reward every time you choose to re-equip your party. If a weapon has a special property, do you give it to a robot with already boosted attack, or offer it to a human that can get more usage from it during a long trek? The robot class introduces all these new opportunities and challenges, which is great stuff. Other classes have also received helpful improvements. Mutants now start off with an offensive spell by default, monster transforms actually work, and while human stat growth is random now, the removal of easy access to stat boosts means gold can be allocated to specific gear and items, which is arguably more strategic. And you're going to need all this new offensive potential because the enemies are packing like milk. I mean sure, occasionally you'd have to battle 4 or so enemies in the previous game, but here, encounters are absolutely rigged. I mean look at this, I'm fighting 9 guys at once. Now here's me fighting 10 more. The quantity of enemies depends on your progress throughout each level. Generally, the overworld will start off with smaller numbers just to get you introduced, and then later on during a dungeon, the packs will become much larger. This allows for a smoother difficulty curve without compromising the tension of dungeon crawling. Increasing the number of enemies would further provoke players to bolster their offense to reduce the barrage of enemy attacks. Every random encounter becomes a quick Royal Rumble to see which team can out-damage each other first, with the new condition that enemies need to wipe out your entire party to get a game over. Naturally, these regular fights have been amped up to a more serious threat. All the potions in your inventory won't mean anything if there's no one left to drink them. For this playthrough I used my robots as defensive walls while my mutants would blast spells at the back, though other strategies I liked involved the usage of the new Magi system. Throughout the game you collect these magic warbies that boost certain attributes or come with unique skills. They're locked behind story progression, so you only start getting overpowered stuff later on. They remind me of the job system from Final Fantasy III, and just like that game, there are also additional party members that chime in for each level. Much like Magi, the characters you recruit progressively become stronger. allowing for a meaningful difficulty curve thanks to the curated nature of this game's mechanics. I see Yoko Taro here is appropriately fitted with his ninja gauntlets. The dungeons also fit this new design mentality by being more straightforward. Most branching paths are brief and level gimmicks are kept to a minimum. Even the super dungeon is more tedious than difficult to navigate, and it's completely optional anyway. The one-directional momentum of the dungeons also allow for much less backtracking. You're always making progress and every dungeon can be directly exited after defeating its boss, adamant on putting more emphasis on the gauntlet of encounters. Because every dungeon is basically a straight line, there are more ways to contextualize them with the unique settings this game offers. The world setup from the previous game returns with even crazier locales. You've got this underwater volcano, this funky floor, Luigi's mansion, and space of course. These stranger settings can also help play into the direct dungeon design. A clear example is the Dragon Racing world. The dungeon here is as linear as it gets, and yet it makes perfect sense. It's a clever way of reinterpreting the simplicity of a Game Boy RPG into a Hot Wheels track without needing to expend additional resources. Another great example is the part where you go inside this lady. 92 hit different. This area has you navigating to different limbs, going through all the veins and intestines. It's as linear as all the other dungeons, but this blood circuitry setup ties the aesthetic and gameplay nicely together. My favourite part of the game is when you reach Valhalla. If your party got knocked out during a battle, Odin would offer free revives to restart the battle. But since you've been fighting other gods throughout the game, eventually you make it to his crib and he goes all Sephiroth on you. He's rather cheeky and even revives you if you lose to him. He's a real tough boss too, with his 2 Crutters sidemen. And yeah, once you beat him, you can't revive your party anymore, cause, you know, you just broke into his house and beated him to death. Ah yes, burn the elderly. The bizarreness is only amplified by the esoteric, very Game Boy dialogue. More infamously, thanks to this game's localization, the opium drug trade segment has been replaced with bananas.
Well then, how are the bananas? You have nothing to worry about. Here they are, all nice and safe. Squeeze more money from the townsman. Oh sir, you are bad.
That is very nice compliment, but not as bad as you! The finale is as great as the previous game too, and it even mirrors it in some ways. Before you yeeted to heaven to chainsaw God, but now you recruit God and descend to hell. Let me turn small. The final boss has cool graphics. It even changes the music mid-battle. Dang. The way you go down these steps as the background brightens also contrasts the previous ascent's darkening background. It's all nicely symmetrical, which I think is a great way to describe this game. Legend 2 differentiates quite a lot from Legend 1's core design, but it's in a way that directly mirrors the endurance-based gameplay of older RPGs. This duality of design is represented cleanly thanks to the simple nature and limitations of the Game Boy. The SaGa series would go on to favour battle mechanics in their design much like every other modern RPG, and I think Legend 2 did well in setting up that future, with gameplay systems as futuristic as the robots you roam with. And so, our heroes jump out of the window, along with the rest of the narrative. And look, there's me going up too. Goodbye.